Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has arrived in Beijing and has held high-level talks with her counterpart, Qin Gang. The two discussed Beijing's tensions with Taiwan, the war in Ukraine and human rights issues in China. Baerbock is scheduled to meet with other Chinese officials on her three-day trip, including the vice president and the top senior foreign policy diplomat. Baerbock called on Beijing, an ally of Russia, to exert influence on Moscow to bring the war in Ukraine to an end.
It's a good thing that China has signaled its willingness to work towards a solution here. But I have to say, frankly, that I wonder why the Chinese position so far hasn't included calling on the aggressor Russia to stop the war.
For more on the German Foreign Minister's visit to China, I'm now joined by correspondent Fabian Kretschmer in Beijing and DW's chief international editor Richard Walker here in Berlin. Fabian, let's start with you. The press conference has just finished, I understand. What message did Baerbock send in that press conference to her Chinese counterpart?
I think there were two core messages. One was about the war in Ukraine. Baerbock has said that on the one hand, she thinks it's good that China is in general showing some willingness to solve the crisis. But on the other hand, she said a rather frank statement. She said, I have to wonder why the Chinese position so far has not included calling on Russia, the aggressor, to stop this war. That is really quite a frank statement and is a clear request towards China to put more pressure on Russia to help end this war. And second issue is Taiwan. She has said that any unilateral or violent change of the status quo is unacceptable and is also a red line for Germany and Europe. So she said this conflict must be solved peacefully.
Richard, based on their statements, how far apart are the German and the Chinese foreign ministers on the issues of Taiwan and Ukraine?
Yeah, well, if we just hear what Fabian mentioned there, it is pretty clear that there is quite a bit of distance. I mean, we just heard from Fabian what Annalena Baerbock said with respect, for instance, to Taiwan, that this is very much Germany's concern, that, you know, the impact on trade would be devastating if there were a conflict across the Taiwan Strait. Qin Gang, her Chinese counterpart, simply saying, this is our core interest. We won't give up 1 inch of territory. And on this question of Ukraine, we just heard Fabian quoting Annalena Baerbock there with a pretty blunt message. You know, this is Putin's war. It's up to him to end it. Qin Gang repeating the Chinese position, which is close to Russian talking points, that you have to recognize the security interests of all. Otherwise, you only end up in conflicts and war. So essentially saying that the implication there being that Russia was somehow forced into this war by a feeling of threat from the West.
Fabian, we've been talking a lot about what Europe wants from China. What does China want from Europe?
Yeah, I would say China has basically 3 big goals. One is to continue business as usual. They want to keep the trade relations with the European Union, a trade relation that is actually becoming more and more imbalanced. I mean, the trade deficit has basically doubled in the past 3 years or so. I mean, so it's basically in favor for the Chinese side. The second thing is they want to prevent any transatlantic solidarity. They don't want to have, Brussels being closer to Washington. And the third thing is that they also want to prevent is that the European Union will find a unified critical strategy towards China. They rather want to divide each countries and deal with them bilaterally.
Richard, there have been quite a few European leaders travelling to China in recent days, namely President Macron of France, and they were sending mixed messages. Who needs who more right now, Europe, China, or the other way around?
Yeah, well, as we've just heard from Fabian, I think he summed up very well what China kind of wants from Europe, and basically for things to kind of get back to normal business, to get humming again is their primary interest. But of course, from the European side, they have this very specific ask. They want China to lean on Vladimir Putin to stop the war in Ukraine. And the big question is China going to do that? There's a lot of speculation about whether this war actually suits China's interests to some extent by making Russia even more dependent on that relationship. So that's the big ask that the Europeans are coming with. And so far, there's not a huge signal from the Chinese that they're really going to comply with it.
DW's chief international editor Richard Walker and our correspondent Fabian Kretschmer there. Thank you very much. And I'm now joined by Boris Mijatovic, a member of the German Bundestag for the Green Party, of which Annalena Baerbock is also a member. And he's the vice chair of the German-Chinese parliamentary group. Now, one question I want to start with, the message that Annalena Baerbock has sent there to her Chinese counterpart, shouldn't it have been a bit clearer?
Well, good morning, first of all. The message Annalena Baerbock sent was clear enough in my terms. It's clearly said, or she clearly said, that Europe stands together. European Union is together in a strategy on rule of law and together on market issues. So if you want to access and enter and make trade and business in European Union, you have to deal with all 27 together. And this is a clear message to Beijing, to the Communist Party. There can no be a selection of friends. There is only one European Union.
Well, but the unity is not so great. Last week, French President Macron made comments that suggested Europe should not get dragged into an escalation between the US and China over Taiwan. Does he have a point? Is the US really trying to provoke China?
I don't think so. If you look on the trade relations, Taiwan has become one of the top 20 economies in the world. The dependence on chips, on electronic devices is high. So she clearly made the point, Annalena Baerbock clearly made the point, it would be devastating if China would go in an aggression towards Taiwan. So our interest in the European Union is common. I heard the French president saying statements, but I see him in the position with 26 partners. So having a point of view in European Union is one thing, but dividing the countries is another thing. I see no divide between Paris and Berlin.
But the confusion you can see?
No.
Okay. Baerbock is just the latest in a line of European politicians who've travelled to China in the past 6 months. We just mentioned Macron. Could all these trips with all these different messages do more harm than good, you think?
It is important to be in touch, to be in communication. We have had an era of free trade relations among the world. So it's important to be among the top countries, the largest economies in the world, to be in discussions. And of course, we need more pressure on Moscow to end up this aggression in Ukraine. Still, people are dying every day, and we see aggression, horrible crimes happening in Ukraine. And it cannot be left alone that a permanent member of the Security Council is not aligning internationally and condemning this situation. Any aggression in the world is a danger for the peaceful relations of trade, of people. So if Beijing is interested to be part of the free world, to be part of these economic situations, then it should put pressure, more pressure on Moscow to end this aggression and to end this criminal behavior of Mr. Putin.
Now, in more general terms, the idea of German foreign policy toward China, at least for the last 2 decades, was to help democratize countries like Russia or China through cooperation and trade. Was that a bit naive, you think?
Well, today it looks like to have been naive, but it was without alternative. People that make trade do not make war. That was the conviction. So today we see maybe we have missed out a point on this. We have to look on the values as well. So we look into criminal activities like Mr. Putin is doing with his aggression. And we say this cannot be, ignored. If we follow international rules, then we will condemn aggression. If we don't follow international rules, we leave the floor open for any aggression anywhere in the world. And this cannot be in the interest of countries that have a free trade situation.
Boris Mijatovic there, a member of the German Parliament for the Green Party and a vice chair of the German-Chinese parliamentary group. Thank you very much.
Thank you and have a nice day.